Bonjour, donc aujourd'hui on va regarder le Love-Hate de Pixel Crusher. Okay. Ce qui m'intéresse, regardez là, être sûr que je tombe sur la bonne chose. Ce qui va m'intéresser de regarder, c'est la partie où ce que on a un profil psychologique, puis les gens vont aimer, ils vont avoir une mémoire entre eux autres, et il y a aussi une barre de happiness. Puis là-dedans, ce que je voulais, c'était que les personnages peuvent partager des connaissances entre eux autres, liées au niveau de leur expérience dans le jeu, pour le partager avec d'autres factions en même temps. Donc, si les citoyens s'entremêlent, peuvent se parler entre eux autres, partager certaines un amour-haine aussi, et le joueur en tant que tel va pouvoir influencer leur comportement via possiblement une tribune, quelque chose comme ça, pour pouvoir discuter avec eux autres de comment ils voient une autre faction, comment ils apprécient une autre faction, comment ils détestent une autre faction. Ça pourrait influencer le comportement des personnages. Donc, ça serait de voir comment une discussion pourrait apporter un effet sur les personnages, puis un effet entre eux autres qui pourrait avoir un effet sur les factions adverses. Assez compliqué, mais on va regarder, voir qu'est-ce qui est possible de faire. Bon.
To set up the villager for the dialogue system's selector, add a usable component.
Je l'avance un peu, là. Regardez c'est quoi qui parle ici. Là. C'est quoi ça ici? Ça c'est les dialogues.
Really generating quests.
Ok, ça c'est dialogue system. Je suis pas dans la bonne place. On veut le love-hate. Dialogue. Playlist. Love-hate.
This is OutSystems, the most complete full-stack application development platform for professional development.
Okay. Bon.
This is the first video in a series on describes the basic scene in which we'll...
On va attendre, je vais regarder, m'assurer que j'ai la bonne chose. TS. Player. Ok. Qu'est-ce qu'il dit ici?
We also have a circular area that we'll use in a later video. The player has a simple movement and attack script. The NPCs have a script that reacts to the player's attack by destroying the NPC. I've also imported Love-Hate, but I haven't done anything with it yet. This is what the scene looks like.
If and sign.
In the next video, we'll set up Love-Hate.
Bon, prochaine vidéo, Love-Hate. Ok. Shit. Commence. Action. Action indeeds. Ok, ça se passe pas mal là. Okay.
In Love-Hate, a character's personality and relationships are represented by a faction. Factions are maintained in a faction database. To create a faction database asset, select Create Pixel Crusher's Love-Hate Faction Database.
Okay.
The first section is Personality. Here you can define the personality traits that you'll model in your characters. The Templates foldout has some examples that you could start with, such as the traditional ocean model used in psychology.
Donc, ici, c'est dans le template, le océan. Donc, openness, générale appréciation des arts, des émotions, conscience, discipline, engagement, considérer, neuroticité, tendance à avoir, de l'anxiété, de la colère. Ok.
There's also an example containing personality traits appropriate for a typical role-playing game.
Ok. Pour RPG, charité, kindness, orthodoxe, violence. Okay. Comment que ça se pourrait jouer entre les rôles? Comment qu'on crée ça? C'est une bonne question.
In this tutorial, we'll just define a simple alignment trait, where negative values are more evil and positive values are more good. Values in love-hate are generally in the range of negative 100 to positive 100, so a character with plus 100 alignment would be angelic. Factions can also have relationships to other factions, which is a key part of love-hate. Each relationship can be measured in a number of different ways. The basic relationship trait is affinity, which is a general measure of love or hate for the other faction.
Je me demande si ça pourrait pas justement être ce qui permettrait de faire comme si je change ce trait-là pour on est allié avec eux autres, si ça pourrait influencer là, le courant là, du jeu par rapport à ça. Okay,
you could add more traits such as respect, lust, obligation, and so on. For now, we'll stick with affinity. Factions can be parents and children of other factions. The inheritance drop-downs for personality and relationships specify how child factions inherit the values of their various parents. Presets are templates that you can apply to factions to save time. For example, all villagers in an RPG might be based off the same template, but then customized. For this tutorial, we won't define any templates. Factions are where it all comes together. A faction can represent a group or an individual. Each character typically has its own faction, although they may have parent group factions in common. For example, in an RPG, the butcher, the baker, and the candlestick maker might all have their own faction, but they could have a villager's parent faction in common. For some generic characters, such as generic goblins in an RPG, you can apply the same faction to all of them. In each faction, you'll specify its parent factions, if any, its personality traits, and its starting relationships. Note that these can all change during play. Typically, parents only change when you manually change them with an API call or visual scripting action. But personality traits and relationships will change automatically as characters witness events in the game. To save typing, I'm going to switch over to a faction database in which I've already set up factions. In this database, the Orc faction is a child of the Monster faction, for example. After we've defined factions, we'll need to set up the representations of those factions in the scene by adding faction members. First, add a faction manager game object by selecting Game Object Love-Hate Faction Manager. Assign your faction database.
Okay. Love-Hate. Donc, on a des templates avec des profils ici déjà établis.
Then inspect a character game object and add a faction member component.
Ok, fait que mettons joueur. Faction member.
First, specify the faction that this game object represents. PAD is a standard psychological model that represents a character's emotional state across 3 vectors: pleasure, arousal, and dominance. When a character experiences something that it thinks is good, its pleasure increases, and so on. We're going to skip the rest of these values for now. They're used to fine-tune the way faction members work. Tooltips and the manual explain them in detail.
Donc, si je comprends bien, on va le
First, specify the faction that this game object represents. PAD is a standard psychological model that represents a character's emotional state across 3 vectors: pleasure, arousal, and dominance. When a character experiences something that it thinks is good, its pleasure increases, and so on. We're going to skip the rest of these values for now. They're used to fine-tune the way faction members work. Tooltips and the manual explain them in detail. At this point, I'll load a scene in which I've added faction members to a number of characters. The last step is to define deeds, which are events that can happen in the game. Note that a deed doesn't actually perform the gameplay event. It simply reports that the event, such as a sword swing, has occurred. The event itself is performed outside of love-hate, such as with the player controller script on the player. Deeds define what the events mean to love-hate characters. You can report deeds entirely in code, but it's easiest to predefine them in a deed template library. In the project, select Create, Pixel Crushers, Love-Hate, Deed Template Library. Here, I've created a simple deed template library with one deed, which reports that an actor has killed a subject. let's examine the details. You can require that characters have a clear line of sight to witness the deed, and that they must be within a certain distance. In this case, we'll skip that. Then we'll define what the deed means to witnesses. Impact specifies whether the deed is good or bad for the subject. Getting killed is clearly bad, so it's set to a negative value. It's also an aggressive act, so aggression is high. This affects witnesses' dominance in the pad values. Finally, all personality traits in your faction database will be listed here. When a character judges a deed, it will judge deeds more kindly the closer the deed's personality traits align with the character's personality traits. Add a deed reporter component to the player and assign the deed template library.
Deed reporter.
Finally, we use a variation of the player controller script that reports the deed. The complete love-hate API is online, but in this case, it's simply a call to the deed reporter's report deed method. The full API lets you do much more, such as creating new factions at runtime and changing parents and personalities. But in this video, we're just introducing the basics. Before we play the scene, I've also added a faction member debugger component to the characters. This utility component shows brief love-hate information above the character's head. If we attack an orc, you'll see that the witnesses' relationships and paths have changed. These deeds are also recorded in the character's memory. Memories remain for durations that are based on their relative importance to the character. Your other AI and branching conversations can check the resulting affinity values to decide on actions. In the next video, we'll cover automatic reactions.
This is OutSystems, the most complete full-stack application development platform for professional developers.
In this video, we'll show how to add automatic reactions. I've started with the scene from the previous video, and I've added a deed reaction events component to each character. When a character witnesses a deed, this component invokes events based on the character's resulting pleasure value.
On ajoute le deed reporter. Là, ça va être le deed reaction. Deed reaction script. Ça va se faire en fonction du personnage témoin. Okay.
I've added entries for negative, neutral, and positive pleasure. Each event plays an animation that indicates the character's emotional state. This is what it looks like. If we pause and inspect a character, we can see its state, including relationships and pad. You can also add a stabilized pad component if you want a character's emotional state to return to a certain value, such as neutral, over time. Two components similar to deed reaction events are greeting trigger and gossip trigger. Greeting trigger checks affinities when one character enters the trigger collider of another character. For example, if the player enters a knight's greeting trigger area and the knight likes the player, the knight could salute or wave. The other component is the gossip trigger. When a character enters the trigger collider of another character, and if the characters like each other, that is, they have positive affinity to each other, the gossip trigger allows them to share their memories of past deeds. This way, information about deeds can spread organically through a population. The potency of this gossip decays the further it goes along the telephone chain, based on how much characters trust each other and how well or poorly the deed aligns with the listener's personality.
Ok, donc le greeting script va avoir une réaction. Time et Civilisation arabe. Bon. Ça ici.
There are also corresponding script events that you can use in your own scripts that cover these events and more. The list of events are covered in the manual. In the next video, we'll cover auras, which are areas of the scene that can affect a character's pad values.
Bon, les auras, je pense pas avoir vraiment besoin de
In
ça.
this video, we'll cover auras, which are areas of the scene that can affect a player's pleasure, arousal, dominance, or pad emotional values. In the scene, we have a spooky, mysterious circle. I'll add a trigger collider and an aura trigger.
Bon, j'irai pas là. Je pense pas avoir utilisé ça. Je me suis dit, je vais écouter des fois si on aurait besoin par rapport à la tribune. Mais la tribune, je veux pas qu'elle change quoi que ce soit. En fait, c'est vraiment la communication qu'il y aurait avec la tribune s'il y avait quelque chose par rapport à ça. Le reste, ça va être vraiment standard là, par rapport à ça. Donc la question en fait là, c'est ce qu'on a vu, c'est qu'il y a une possibilité que les personnages se construisent une faction at runtime. Donc tout le monde pourrait comme être neutre, puis il y a possibilité de créer une faction. Donc je vais marquer ça, ce qui signifie que l'on peut créer on peut commencer neutre. Et c'est une faction de joueurs. Okay. C'est pas mal ça. Donc, qu'est-ce qui ferait que tu serais un ennemi avec l'autre? Ben, c'est vraiment la même chose aussi. Là. On a vu qu'il y avait Happiness déjà dans le logiciel par rapport au Game Engine. Donc, tu sais, ça on voit que vraiment là, qu'est-ce qui fait qu'un ennemi puis que c'est une bonne chose en fait, c'était vraiment la question d'aujourd'hui. Qu'est-ce qui fait qu'un il y a des trucs qu'on peut voir dans le fond. Si un autre joueur inconnu mal vu. Joueur attaque un personnage. protagoniste. Puis on pourrait faire même aussi. Donc c'est. Un joueur protagoniste. 3. Un joueur déclare. Un joueur déclare. Ça devrait être suffisant pour interagir. Donc on va avoir le pad qui va jouer avec ça. Puis la happiness, il faut que je regarde, probablement que je vais utiliser les valeurs qui sont soit du Survival Engine directement dedans ou synchroniser ça là, pour que ça soit la même chose par rapport à ça. Mais ça devrait être assez simple en fonction de ce qu'on a vu ici. Donc, si avec quoi que ce soit, des points que vous voudriez apporter, quoi que ce soit, ne gênez-vous pas. Donc, ça va conclure la partie pour le Love Hate aujourd'hui. Merci.